So then we've got Caspar David Friedrich. He was a German romantic landscape painter of the time, and generally considered the most important German artist of his generation. Um, he he's highly thought of in Germany, and is where, just like Rembrandt is considered like one of the most important Dutch artists, Caspar David Friedrich is that for Germany. His paintings are usually allegorical landscapes, which typically feature contemplative figures, and he was a pantheist. Now, a pantheist, that term we've seen before in things like the pantheon, which means essentially all gods. But when we're talking about the romantic notion of pantheism, it's not necessarily a belief in a lot of gods. It is specifically a belief in the divine nature of, well, nature. That nature is divine, and that one's spiritual allegiance is owed to nature. And if one wants to commune with whatever spiritual entity there might be, that is in nature itself. And so we get paintings not unlike this one, Abbey in an Oak Forest, that he painted from 1809 to 1810, that is expressive of that idea. Now, first off, it's as you can see, it was an old medieval abbey church at some point in this area that has now become overgrown with trees. Nature has taken back the thing that man built there. Right? I mean, here there are even like all these like cemetery gravestones that are falling apart and crumbling below. This nature doesn't care about that. But again, it's symbolic. If Friedrich sees the divine in nature, then it sort of is, it's particularly symbolic that nature then has ripped down this old place where people worshipped the Christian God. And it's not, his paintings are full of scenarios where man or groups of men and women, I'll give him some credit there. He has some paintings where women are participating in this as well, are confronted with the sublimity of nature. This is called Wanderer Above Sea of Fog from 1818. And it's just this moment, like a wanderer. There's this guy just wandering around, hiking, and decides to walk over in this direction and say, I wonder what's over here. Let me take a look. And then just being awestruck by the beauty of the nature that he has been confronted by. Sky, mountains in the distance, fog rolling below his feet in what seems to be sort of a valley below, trees off in the distance. All of it so overwhelming. And this man has just paused and can't do anything but just sort of stand and look, communing with the spiritual that is within nature. We have Joseph M.W. Turner. Sometimes you'll just find him listed as J.M.W. Turner. He was British. He's a British romantic painter, printmaker, and watercolorist who was known for his use of very expressive color, his imaginative landscapes, his turbulent, often violent marinescapes. He liked seascape paintings, especially if they were like taking down a ship, or the waves were like crashing and taking down a ship. I don't think I have any of those as examples, but it was something he was known for. And he believed in this romantic concept, and if I were you, I would take a note of this. He believed in this romantic notion that was called individual genius. Individual genius. This is a romantic tenet that maintained that art should not come from any other source but the inspired, the emotionally, spiritually, whatever inspired mind of the artist. That an artist should work by inspiration and intuition. And as such, he ends up being this very eccentric personality. Right? He's like, he decides, I'm not going to give two flying flips what anybody thinks of me in this society. I'm just going to live how I want to live. And even though he became really highly sought after and a famous artist in his own time, he never lived above his station. He always maintained a middle-class lifestyle throughout his life. Even though he could afford the finer things in life, he never did. So his example that we'll look at of romanticism is this piece here, The Burning of the Houses of Parliament in 1834. Right, so talk about one of the characteristics that we sometimes will see in romantic painting is a sense of patriotism, nationalism. And here we see Turner painting an event that happened. He was actually there and witnessed and saw this when the Houses of Parliament, a symbol of the constitutional monarchy that Britain was at this time, had caught fire. And seeing that was excruciatingly devastating on Turner. And so when he paints it in such a way as to showcase that emotion. Move myself over here. First off, Turner didn't paint in any way that could be called traditional. He would stab the canvas with paintbrushes. He would use his fingernails and scratch into it. He'd throw dirt onto the canvas. He would spit. He would spit on his canvases. And where other painters had certain ways of holding their brushes and flicking of the wrist and all these techniques, he would just jab and grind his paintbrushes into it, and sometimes even use the actual handle of the paintbrush and grind that in, so that his paintings take on this extremely expressive nature, this impasto, and the sense that a human being actually made the thing, right? He doesn't seem to be trying to pretend that this is real life that we're looking at, right? No, we see the paint, we see how the paint is piled on, we see all of it, and it feels extremely emotional as a result. More so then, we see, like, back in here, we can see the actual houses of Parliament that are burning, right? And if that's the height of the Parliament building, then this huge tornado of flames is rising like into the stratosphere. It's so big, right? He's exaggerated the size of the actual flames because it's not about what actually happened that day. It's about what it felt like to be there and witness the place that symbolizes the nation to which you hold yourself as patriotically responsible toward, is burning like that. So the flames are huge. They dwarf all of the boats and people who are below in the Thames, either coming to help or fleeing the fire itself. And it's that color, right? Those oranges and yellows and reds contrasting with the blues of a day that looks like it probably would have been a nice day had this not been happening. What's interesting, however, right, is that, can I get myself, I'm going to be blocking something no matter what, I'll put myself right there, is that Turner, he claims this notion of individual genius, and that a true artist should be working by inspiration alone, and yet he's got sketches where he planned for this painting, right? He was there on that day, and these are little watercolors that he did of the scene as he watched it happen. But you can see him playing around and trying to figure out, like, how will I paint this? So even as much of a romantic, a believer in the notion of individual genius as Turner was, we have evidence here and there of him planning his paintings, which kind of goes opposite of that. And again, industrialized London, you can see him painting what it felt like to be in that situation as well. This is Rain, Steam, and Speed, the Great Western Railway, where it's meant to look like the steam, smoke, gritty feeling, atmospheric scene that he would have been looking at. But it's meant to be emotional. We're meant to see, like up in here, all the places where his fingernails scratched into the painting. There's a story that goes that whenever young artists would visit him at his studio, hoping to maybe get some sage advice from the master, or maybe be taken under his wing or become one of his assistants, the first thing he would always do, before he wouldn't even let them in the door, he would block them from walking in the door, and he would say, "Show me your hands." And they would hold out their hands, and he would look, and he would turn them over, and if he didn't see paint in the creases and crevices of their hands, and if he didn't say paint and charcoal caked up underneath their fingers, he would say, "You're no artist," and he would send them away. That's the romantic way of looking at things. All right, so next, then, I have a video that will be in Google Classroom attached to all of this that I want you to look at. It's a very short clip from a movie called Mr. Turner that was about the life of Joseph M.W. Turner. It's just a very brief thing because I wanted you to see it. For this, the scene goes on longer than what I wanted you to specifically look at, which is the scene, which was like this is something that he was documented to have done many times, where a painting of his has been accepted into the Royal Academy in London, and he has decided he's still not happy with it. So even though the painting is on the wall, he shows up and starts slathering more paint on it and spitting at it and scratching it. It's on the wall. It is being displayed for people to see, and he still does this to it. So once you watch that, after that's over, it like cuts to a different scene in the movie. If you want to end it there, that's fine. Okay, now let's come back to France, because it's important we spend a little time in France and see how things are going to happen during this little bit of time here as the neoclassical era and the romantic era are clashing, because they're clashing hard in France, and how that's going to lead toward what will eventually be the modern art movement that we're going to get into in the late 19th century on into the 20th century. So if we take a look at what's going on in France at this time, France is an empire, because Napoleon Bonaparte, as we talked about in the earlier video, who was a military and political leader during the French Revolution, had surprisingly proclaimed himself Napoleon I, Emperor of France, and coronated himself. And he begins what become known as the Napoleonic Wars, which were a series of military campaigns that were launched in order to conquer all of the bordering nations. And by 1812, he had conquered or established allies he had conquered or had become allied with most of the European mainland nations, and had moved campaigns into the Middle East and into Northern Africa as well. And he used propaganda. We've already looked at that a little bit. We already touched on that some with what he was doing with David, who he sort of saw as his own personal artist in his pocket. He was a brilliant propagandist. He used art as a means to convince soldiers to fight for him, because he'd already seen how well that worked in his days during the Revolution, to advertise his power, to portray himself as a kind and humanitarian ruler. And one could argue about it, but for the most part, no, I mean, Napoleon is not particularly known for being kind and benevolent, or humanitarian for that matter. Right? He was completely unprovoked, declaring war on everyone around him and trying to invade everybody on the continent. But again, he needs to have a good image for the people. So propaganda art it is. He, interestingly, continued the Academy salons, so that was one thing that remained in place, the Royal Academy. And the exhibitions became even more of a government institution. Now, by 1815, the British defeated Napoleon. King Louis the 18th was reinstated, and Napoleon was placed in exile as a war criminal, and France found themselves right back at square one. After everything that they fought for in the French Revolution, they found themselves underneath a dictator. Finally, they get the dictator kicked out, and the monarchy is put back in place. A constitutional monarchy, but a monarchy nonetheless. Now, getting back to the Academy salons, and those exhibitions becoming even more important. An important thing here is that Napoleon liked both the neoclassical artwork in France and the Romantic artwork in France, and he was a patron of both, and he influenced the Royal Academy and the salons to start allowing in some of the Romantic artists. All right, so this is a map of Europe at the time of Napoleon at his height. Everything that we see in green, dark green, or light green are the empire, or at least areas that were under Napoleon's control. You look at that: Spain, all the way through France, up into the Netherlands, this area over here that would have been which is part of modern day Germany, Switzerland, all of Italy again, and then we have in blue all the states that have allied with the French Empire. In pink, we have those countries that set themselves up as directly in opposition of France. And then, though it's not really showcased here, but he made movements into the Ottoman Empire. You can see this line right here. This is one of the wars that he led into Egypt and into Palestine, and managed to gain a little bit of control of those areas as well. And we already looked a little bit at this guy, Jean-Auguste Dominique Eng, earlier in this lecture. But here we're going to go ahead and dive into him. Now, we just spent a lot of time talking about the Romantics, right? And now we've got to talk about somebody who was a French neoclassical painter, but he is on the scene at the same time as the Romantics, and so he becomes kind of an interesting character. He was trained in the David-esque academic style of the time, traveled and painted in Rome and Florence, developed a style that he believed to be truer, quote unquote, to the ancient Greek classicism. I understand I particularly like specifically Jean-Auguste Dominique Eng's drawings. They are inspiration to my own drawings. He was very full of himself, however. He was influenced by Raphael and other high Renaissance artists, so he is looking back at the High Renaissance. The High Renaissance was looking back at ancient Greece and ancient Rome, so it only really makes sense. He was the director of the French Academy in Rome because he wanted so badly to be a high-ranking official in the French Academy that finally, once he was given this opportunity to go be the director of the French Academy in Rome, it wasn't the same as being a high-ranking member in France itself, but he took it. It finally meant he had arrived. He became influential on later modernists, particularly one that we'll talk about when we get to modern art, Edgar Degas. He was known for, among other things, his Orientalist paintings of nude women. Now, that's a term that I would also write down if I were in your shoes. Orientalist, or Orientalism. That, we'll talk about it when we get to it, when we see it happen. All right? Just as a reminder, this is the guy we're talking about, right? He's the one who painted this piece of Napoleon on his imperial throne. This is probably the painting of his that you are familiar with, because this painting is ubiquitous, right? It is very well known around the world, the Grand Obelisk. And he painted this in 1814. It showcases, at least to a certain extent, just how caught between the neoclassical ideology and the Romantic ideology that Eng was. And by the way, I know it's spelled, it looks like it should be Ingres. It's French, so his last name is Eng. And Eng is painting this in a very neoclassical manner. The color palette is very neoclassical. The very hard-edged, crisp style is very neoclassical. But he's got subject matter that's very romantic in nature. Right? He seems to be appealing at least to that same the same draw toward exotic subjects that the Romantics were drawn to. And to a certain extent, that was because the public was very interested in that kind of thing. So an odalisque is a woman in a Turkish harem. That would have been considered exotic if you were a 19th century white dude from France, right? But look at her. She sure is, for someone who's supposed to be Turkish, she sure is lily white, isn't she? She's surrounded with all the trappings that, again, would have seemed extremely exotic if you were a white dude in Europe at the time, right? The bedclothes, the extravagant embroidery, sheets, the sort of feather duster that she's holding, the over here to the right, the hookah that's set up here, the fact that she's nude, unashamed of it, the fact that she would be part of a harem, which to European dudes sort of like, oh my goodness, that's so dirty and so naughty, right? But he's still not willing to go the full distance to paint her with the markers of the ethnicity that she would have been coming from the region that she would be coming from. Instead, he makes her a little more safe. He paints her as this lily white young woman that would have been considered sort of classically beautiful to Europeans of the time. Another interesting thing that he's done here is that many people have noted that he made the Grand Odalisque's back, like there have been people who have like scientifically measured this, and she should have like at least 2 extra vertebrae in that extremely long back of hers, right? Which also kind of goes counter to the neoclassical way that he was trained. So it seems like he always had this little bit of a flirtation with Romanticism while never quite going all the way there. In fact, in 1824, which is when this painting is released, he decides because he's not getting the respect that he believes he deserves, and so he goes back to his very neoclassical roots with this particular painting, the Vow of Louis XIII, and is finally accepted into one of the salons. He's accepted into the salon of 1824 with this piece, which is a depiction of the story as it goes that Louis XIII, who's quite a ways back in history at this point, who devoted his new kingdom to the Virgin Mary, swore a vow to devote his new kingdom to the Virgin Mary. So we get Louis XIII down here, draped in the fleur-de-lis, the classic symbol of France. And while up above the Virgin Mary, baby Jesus, in the clouds as these angels sort of part the curtains, right? And he is completely and utterly referring back to an old painting from a good 300 years prior by Raphael from the High Renaissance Madonna and Child with 2 angels. Look at that scene up there at the top, right? That Mary and this Mary are no doubt based on one another. The compositions are even extremely similar, right? Like we see the influence that he's taking from Raphael, and he would say that is the right way to do it. Now, I also want to bring up this particular piece of his because it's another one. This one, interestingly enough, done very late in his life in 1862, the Turkish bath. Because again, it's one of his Orientalist paintings. Oh, I forgot to define Orientalism. Right, Orientalism. This is a trend amongst European artists, writers, music composers, what have you, those involved in the arts, of looking to what were considered quote unquote more primitive cultures. That the term Oriental we often hear as a very insensitive term for people who are from Asia, but at this particular moment in time, it would have been referred to as the Middle and Near East, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, the Israel, maybe down into Egypt as well, and it was looking toward that as an exotic place, but also as a place that is more primitive and as such something to be admired because there's something that those people must be in touch with that we are no longer in touch with because we have advanced to this point that we have advanced to, right? It's problematic way of thinking about it, right? But this was a thing at the time, and audiences were hungry for paintings that exhibited these exotic people and places. And ENG was willing to give that to us. But again, look at just how much lily white skin there is in what is supposed to be a Turkish bath, right? Now, the reason I bring this up is because we're going to see a contrast to it, but also because we're going to get to some things that are going to happen in the modern era that I want to call your attention back to this piece when we get there. Eugène Delacroix, born in 1798, dies around about the same time as ENG, but 1798, he's nearly 20 years younger than ENG, putting him solidly in the new generation of romantics who are coming up in France. So he was a French romantic artist and became sort of like the de facto leader of the French Romantic movement. So that just makes him all the more irksome for ENG at this particular moment in time. He's known for, as most of the romantics that we talked about are, his expressive brushstrokes and depiction of optical effects of color, influenced by the Mannerist and Baroque art, particularly their chaotic and asymmetrical compositions. Um, and yeah, he was fierce rivals with Eng. Eng couldn't stand him. He couldn't stand Eng. They both had such different ideas about life, about art, about what France should look like and what it should be. They clashed, and the stories, if you ever have a chance to read anything about these two, it's fun stuff. Now, unlike Eng, who did not do these things, he actually traveled to Africa, Palestine, the Near East, and as such, his paintings are also considered Orientalist, but he was painting these emotion-filled interpretations of what he saw, and as such, there's a lot more sympathy that we can see in Delacroix's work that depicts things that happen in the Middle East or the Near East. So this is one of his paintings, Liberty Leading the People, from 1830. By 1830, there's yet another French Revolution that's happening. And the French people are rising again to take down the monarchy, make France a nation by the people for the people, right? And it just makes sense that a romantic would be drawn to this, right? Now, a lot of the same ideals were in place from the earlier French Revolution, but now it's a much more emotional revolution that's happening. And he paints this again as we talk about national pride. There's so much national pride. She is Lady Liberty here carrying the flag, the French flag, right? By the way, Lady Liberty, she is a symbol of liberty. And so, yeah, that is the same Lady Liberty that we have as the Statue of Liberty in New York here in the United States, right? Who was, that particular statue was built or was designed by the studio of Eiffel, the same Eiffel who made the Eiffel Tower, who was French, right? It was a gift to the United States from the French. And so Lady Liberty, it's the same character, right? Lady Liberty, right? So she's leading this group of people to fight, right? She's rousing us forward. Yes, she's also got her breasts out there, which I'm sure Delacroix would point out is meant to be like she's the mother of liberty, right? Whatever. But still, it's a woman with her breasts out. It is what it is. But as everyone's storming whatever they're about to go and fight, look at all the people who have already died, right? In the emotional sense of that, right? It's no longer what we saw happening in David's Oath of Herate, where the women were swooning to one side. And that was indicative of what could happen to these soldiers. No, here it's happening. These people are dead. And the other people in the back are going to have to walk over them. They're not even like beautifully dead, like again, like David's painting that had the dead body almost looking like he had just fallen asleep. No, there's an indignity to the one guy who's had his pants taken off. Right? These bodies are not like dignified, beautifully, just looking like they've fallen asleep bodies. So this is a call to action, but a call to action that doesn't try to prettify the fact that you can die by doing this. But yet, what Delacroix is probably most known for are his paintings of exotic locations and people. Again, I put that exotic in quotations because it's what white European dudes would have found exotic at the time. But he actually traveled to these places. He didn't try to make it up. He didn't try to go by descriptions that he read. He traveled and went to these places and got to know the people that he met and learned their stories. And when he goes, you look at his sketchbooks and you see his watercolors, which, by the way, he was an amazing watercolorist. His watercolors are indicative, and his sketches are indicative of someone who genuinely is fascinated with a culture and wants to portray it truthfully and accurately. So we get a piece like this, the massacre at Chios, or Chios, I'm not entirely certain how to pronounce it. But what's being depicted here is a military attack by the Ottoman Empire on a Greek settlement by the name of Chios on April 11th of 1822. So he's only making this a couple of years after it actually happened. The campaign of these Ottomans coming into the area resulted in tens of thousands of deaths of the citizens of the region, and the forced deportation into slavery of almost everyone who did survive. So we have Delacroix painting this event with a weird amalgamation of insensitive Orientalism and sympathy. Because we see the plight of the people, right? Very similarly to what Goya did in the painting that we looked at. We are given these faces of all of these people who are suffering, who have been brought up here either to be murdered or to be sold into slavery, or perhaps to be raped, as this woman who's been tied up and is being pulled away is most likely her fate. And we're meant to sympathize with them, no doubt about it. We see their faces, we see the anguish, we see the absolute look of shock in this man's face. The nudity that is on display doesn't seem meant to titillate as much as it's meant to show these individuals as being vulnerable. So you can't help but sympathize with them. While the Ottomans are, for the most part, in shadow. Right? They don't seem to be receiving the same light that these individuals down here are receiving. And then we see the city burning in the distance and more violence being done upon people back here. And Oh, yeah, yeah, oh my God. Even one woman who's clearly dead, but a child is with this woman still trying to suckle at her teat. It is raw and it's emotional and it doesn't try to hold back. And there's Orientalism here. Yes, right. There's a fascination with the way people live in a quote unquote primitive society. There's a fascination with how they dress, the way that they battle and war with one another. But there's also this sympathy. He would have spent time amongst the people, getting to know people. This would have been something that would have angered him. He's painting it because it angers him. That's that sympathy that comes through in a lot of his work. But it also doesn't change the fact that in some cases he would just paint things that were meant to excite the European 19th century white clientele who bought his paintings. Right? This painting here, no doubt, is based on actual observation of a lion hunt that would have happened somewhere that he traveled. Right? But the wildness of it, and the swirling nature of the composition, and the brushstrokes, the very visible brushstrokes that he puts down, is where the romanticism comes into play. And as I mentioned earlier, he took a lot of influence from the Baroque, particularly Northern Baroque. So somebody like Peter Paul Rubens here, who did paintings similar to this, right? And he's looking at those the sort of chaotic, off-balanced compositions that Rubens would do, again, a good 200 years earlier, and he's painting things like this, very similar in style, but again, much more based on his own observations. Oh, but also, right, very romantic in the way that he's applied the paint. This doesn't look anything like what the neoclassicists were doing, right? So, I want to point out something. We looked at this painting here on the left, The Vow of Louis XIII by Jean-Auguste Dominique Eng, and we looked over here at the massacre at Chios by Eugene Delacroix in 1824 as well. Both of them have been painted in 1824, and both of them got into the salon that year. This is how the world is changing at this particular moment in time, or how France is changing anyway. So over here, again, you've got Eng. Over here, you got Eugene Delacroix. These two could not stand each other. And you can imagine how for Eng over here, who's finally being accepted into the salon and getting his work displayed there, he's been a member of the Academy for quite some time at this point, but now he has made this very specific choice to go back to his neoclassical roots, and that's what finally gets him in. But also on the same walls in this exhibition is Delacroix over here with what he's got going on. And so you got this is me paraphrasing their arguments with one another, but you got Eng over here. He's like what is even what is this? What is this guy even doing? Like this young guy who doesn't even know how to paint. Look at the way he's painting. Like what is that even supposed to be? And Delacroix, who's over here, like, old man, what is your problem? Like, you're over there painting like a dusty relic from the past, right? Nobody cares about this crap that you're doing anymore. Or, at the very least, all this stuff being based in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, it's been done to death, man. Would you knock it off and let this new generation come up and do our thing? Yeah, but, like, look at you. Like, you don't know how to paint. Your composition is all over the place. You're all hung up in this hedonistic emotions, right? My stuff is calm and orderly, and that's how art should be. But you just go ahead and die already, old man. Look, you're not relevant anymore. You think that you're relevant. You think this because finally the Academy has decided to throw you a bone, and I guess perhaps it was about your time. But man, you just need to go ahead and die so that all these artists and all these people who think like you can get out of the way, and we can turn this world into what we think it should be. You millennials are just ruining everything. Okay, boomer, whatever you say, boomer. This is the kind of relationship these two had. They couldn't stand each other. They had this intense rivalry for one another, and it was because they were right here at this conjunction of two generations with you could not have more opposite ideologies who are where you're sitting here with Eng, who is the old guard about to die out, and Delacroix, who's the young emotional guy, and his generation is coming up, and Eng is looking at that as if they're going to ruin it all. And Delacroix is looking up at Eng and his people like, if people like you would just go ahead and die already, we can make a much better world. And isn't it kind of interesting how, even though that was 200 years ago, we're having similar arguments now between the younger generations and the older generations, at least here in the United States. Right? History repeats itself. We often think that these are new things that are happening, but they've happened before, and long after all of us who are watching, listening to this now are gone, there will still be these clashes between one generation who thinks things should be some way, who see a new generation and their new ideas as threatening. And we see it played out in the paintings of these two passionate artists. So let's look at a little bit of romantic music. So romantic music, if we're talking about the characteristics of romantic music, a few things we can hit on. Now, again, I don't claim to be a huge expert when it comes to music. And I'm much more knowledgeable when it comes to the art of the time. So I will give you these few things that we can look at or look for in romantic music and play you a few pieces, but I just won't be getting into it nearly as deeply as I did with the art. Right. So romantics, you can imagine, right? Everything's going to be emotional. So there starts to be this freedom of form and design, right? Which becomes both more personal and more emotional because composers are starting to feel free to break away from the very stringent rules about how certain pieces should be composed. That fits in many ways with what's happening with the artists of the time. Then there are going to be these dramatic contrasts in dynamics and in pitch. There are chromatic harmonies and discords. Right, we're not always necessarily looking for the music to perfectly harmonize. Then orchestras get even bigger as there were new brass instruments and the valve was developed during this time, and so the orchestra becomes even larger. There start to be woodwinds, brass instruments, even more strings are brought in, and something that's referred to as program music. That's music that is specifically meant to tell a story from beginning to end, become a thing. Emotional themes in music and nationalism, all that stuff. Right? It's very similar to what we saw happening in the art of the time. So we'll listen to a few pieces. I will also include links to the videos with these musical selections in Google Classroom. This one here is Ludwig van Beethoven's Symphony No. 5. You've heard this. It won't be anything new. Now, you can hear how that is meant to be evocative of certain emotions. Ludwig van Beethoven was the rock star of his time when it came to this. This is another piece of his from Symphony No. 9. It's Ode to Joy. Ode to Joy. Right there in the title, it is meant to evoke emotion. And lastly, we'll take a look at one of the late Romantic composers, Richard Wagner from Germany. And this particular piece, which you've no doubt heard at some point in your life, the Ride of the Valkyries from The Valkyrie. This piece is, again, an example of music that is meant to evoke an emotion, but also music that is meant to tell a story. In this case, the mythological Valkyries, these scary creatures, arriving, flying to their destination. So think about scary idea of these Valkyrie creatures arriving, right? Scary emotion. What does he give us? I mean, there's a reason why a lot of movies that are meant to be like spooky, Halloweeny kind of thing will have music that sound a bit like that even to this day. All right, and that is it for me. I know it was a ton of information, but again, this would have been a week if we were meeting in person, face to face. That I would have been teaching on both days, Tuesday and Thursday. That's the reason for the amount of material. Your quiz this week, quiz number 5, will be based purely on my material. You won't have anything from Professor McIntosh. All right, yep, that's it. All right, take care, everybody. I'll see you soon. Bye.